Hey everyone, and welcome to what is really the last and final lecture of this class. This lecture, which is really divided into three parts, examines both international organizations and the concept of international organization in contemporary global studies. So this last set of discussions really rounds out our coverage of both topics in what has been a rather interesting class and one that I've really enjoyed working with all of you on. And for those of you that are interested in taking the UN course next spring, this class kind of serves as a springboard into it. In fact, the UN class really is sort of an unofficial sequel to a lot of the things that we've been talking about, and will look more closely at the role of the United Nations within many of these contemporary global studies and challenges. And so I guess, by way of beginning really the end, I'd like to open up the lecture by asking you some discussion questions, some things for you to think about as we move forward in this lecture, and also things that we can address when we meet back in class next Monday. What roles do international organizations like the UN play in shaping, directing, and defining solutions to current international problems and challenges? I mean, it's a rather straightforward, if somewhat abstract question. But, considering, the increased role of organizations like the UN and also smaller regional organizations like NATO and the European Union, what roles do they play? What responsibilities do they have? What tasks are set before them in effectively addressing the current problems of the 21st century, right? What does the UN do in facing international issues and crises of 2020? And, with that, how successful are international organizations given state interests and capabilities? One thing that we have hopefully taken away from this class, and something that I've imparted since day one, is that international organizations like the UN and others are really only as effective as the member states make them out to be. In other words, the nation state is still largely the paramount source of authority in the world today. And even though there are 193 of these sovereign countries, clearly some have more capabilities than others. But yet, at the end of the day, whether we are talking about a state as powerful as the United States or one as superficial as Somalia, the states are the ones that decide to implement ideas that international organizations give, right? Up until now, with the possible exception of the European Union, and even there, their capabilities are limited to the member states that comprise them. International organizations do not have the ability of executing decision-making. They don't have the power and they lack the authority to actually implement the ideas, the solutions, and the proposals that they come up with. So right there, that kind of tells us that IOs are somewhat limited in their scope as well as their global reach. And yet we still study them because they are absolutely critical today in at least having the international outlook to recognize problems that span more than one country, and if nothing else, just serve as reminders to states what needs to be done and what responsibilities need to be taken into account beyond their own borders. So what roles do international organizations like the UN play in shaping, directing, and defining solutions to current international problems and challenges? In many cases, this could be a really good essay question, allowing you to really be creative in providing an answer. A second question to think about: why does international organization appear so disorganized in addressing issues like conflict resolution, human rights, and environmental concerns? It's sort of ironic that we refer to this as international organization when it really seems like the people at the institutional level really don't know what they're doing, or they are being forced to fight with one hand tied behind their back. If anyone who has studied the United Nations knows, the UN is quite a paradoxical institution It is the most widely regarded international organization out there. It has a significant degree of public legitimacy, right? People look to the UN for guidance, for moral direction, and for setting policy. And yet, the UN as an internally functioning mechanism is an absolute mess. It is crippled by bureaucratic ineptitude. It is populated by a number of individuals who might be, a little bit more than opportunists. And yes, there are people who believe in the cause, and there are those that really want to make a change in the world. But they find themselves so hamstrung by bureaucracy, by oligarchy, by elitism, that, in many cases, what makes it out in the end as a UN resolution or some kind of policy is little more than just a series of brochure bullet points than anything else. And we just kind of hope that the states themselves kind of take them seriously and get creative in implementing them. So when I ask why does international organization appear so disorganized, it begs a follow-up question by asking, are international institutions just simply incapable of making any change? At the absolute best, they might be able to point out what needs to be done, but are they capable of actually implementing the processes that need to make things better? Can they actually improve on stuff? And if the answer is no, then what are the obstacles? No, what are the problems? And, beyond internal bureaucratic limits that the UN or the EU have, are there certain states in the world that just act stubbornly, right? Do certain states need persuading in order to make the world better? Does the United States and China and India, the three most polluting countries in the world, need to be held accountable for their, environmental track record? And even with a country like China, which I have to admit actually has a better environmental policy than the United States does right now. For all of their polluting, the Chinese government is actually pretty active in foresting and reforesting areas, right? The Chinese, government is responsible for planting more than 1 million trees a year. I can't really imagine Donald Trump really doing that, and I have, slightly more optimism with Joe Biden, but I'm not necessarily thinking that this guy, really gives a hoot and doesn't pollute. So do certain states need persuading, right? Can we just simply nudge, pressure, coerce, a small handful of countries that can, all of a sudden, if, made more compliant and cooperative, make the world a better place? I mean, that's something that we can certainly think about in the last few weeks of class here. But if the answer is sure, why not? A third follow-up question is it really the policy of international institutions to go beyond setting policy and shaping ideas? So this kind of goes back to one of the first questions I asked here, and that is, do international organizations do more than just simply, write the brochures and say what needs to be done? Do they have the capability of doing anything else? The European Union is tasked with, certain responsibilities, and they're not exactly liked about it by their members. But, does the UN or Red Cross or Amnesty International or, other, let's say, more humanitarian organizations, do they have the clout? Do they have the mobility to actually implement change? Or is it still resting on the hope that a well-placed speech with maybe a few sound bites that makes it to YouTube can get other people involved? Because if that's the case, and we still have a lot of work to do, and if the only thing that we can do is market, then we better come up with better ways of marketing. We better come up with better ways of persuading not just the lower classes of people, but the upper classes, the people in power that can actually make said changes. And so this is kind of a introduction into this final three-part section that I want to address. And within these three parts, I want to focus really on three subtopics. Now, the first one is one that we have already covered in class, but I haven't really provided a dedicated online lecture to. And so in response to a few of you asking if this stuff was going to be online, I figured, why not? Considering that the rest of class is available for archival research, there's no reason why I shouldn't do that. So this is what we're going to be focusing on in this particular lecture, the limits of and obstacles to frozen conflicts. So we're going to be talking about frozen conflicts in general and the phenomenon of the parastate in particular, a great way to help you understand why frozen conflicts exist. The next lecture will examine the principles of human rights and humanitarian intervention, with the big issue asking you to think about the differences between legality versus morality, right? And here we can get really existential, but I will save that for the next lecture. And then the final one, before the formal conclusion, is one that examines the role of international organizations in protecting the environment, with the main question being, is there a transnational solution to a transnational threat? Pardon the typo there. Is there a transnational solution to a transnational threat, right? There is probably no other existential threat to the planet than environmental challenges, global warming, climate change, extreme climate conditions. And this, of course, will create a chain reaction of other events that cause additional problems. So, for what it's worth, if I can put my money on what I think is the most paramount issue moving forward as we get to the middle part of the 21st century. The environment and climate change affects everybody, and that needs to be tackled as soon as possible. But one step at a time. In this lecture, we are formally looking at something that we have already examined in class, but again, for those of you that didn't take notes and want a more dedicated lecture on this, welcome once again, and for the final time, to our study on frozen conflicts and parastates. Now, these are two vocab words that will be important for you to note as we move into the final writing assignment. And I haven't yet finished writing all of the questions, but I hope to have them up by, let's see, today is Tuesday. I hope to have them up by tomorrow, Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, at the absolute earliest. And that is really your final major assignment in class, aside from finishing out whatever reading evaluations you still need. All right, so one last time. And I know that we have already discussed this in class, but it's worth, just going over for posterity. The term frozen conflict is one that spans more than just simply parastates, but it is worth looking at in detailed definition. What is a frozen conflict? A frozen conflict is more or less a situation in which active armed conflict has been brought to an end, but no peace treaty or other political framework resolves the conflict to the satisfaction of the combatants. Right? In other words, right, a frozen conflict is a negative peace par excellence. Right? If you remember the difference between negative peace and positive peace, a negative peace is one in which there is no active violence. There's no active shooting, no active conflict, no active war, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying elements that cause the conflict have been addressed. Therefore, legally, in a frozen conflict, conflict can start again at any moment, right? And this creates an environment of insecurity and instability. Now, in this case, frozen conflicts go beyond, as I said, the concept of parastates. One very good example that was brought up in the afternoon version of class is the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. Technically, the two states are still at war. There hasn't been an outbreak of violence since the 1950s. There is, for the most part, a ceasefire, but both sides are staring each other down through each other's respective guns. And the slightest trigger, the slightest little thing could set off a chain reaction of events. And these things have happened, unfortunately, over the past ensuing decades. So probably one of the best examples of a frozen conflict and a negative peace is the current situation between North and South Korea. They're not killing each other, but they have not resolved a conflict that began more than 60 years ago. So in this case, the conflict is frozen, but it remains within a perpetual stalemate, since both sides, all sides, if there's more than two, possess an equal amount of leverage and counter-leverage to deny any side an advantage in reaching a desired settlement. In other words, neither side is willing to concede, but neither side can gain leverage any more than they have right now over the other. So it is, in a way, a balance of power, right? But it is a very hostile balance of power, in which both sides are kind of digging in their heels into whatever gains they've made, but they cannot move any further beyond where they currently stand. And so in this case, a frozen conflict is a situation that may actually be perpetuated for the purpose of keeping it a stalemate rather than any one side opting for a breakthrough settlement. In other words, if neither side can gain leverage over the other, right? You might think to yourself, cooler minds might say, why don't we just call it a day? Why don't we just call it sort of a gentleman's agreement? Let's just, agree to disagree and move on. No, because the minute that one side tries to make that concession, the other side will think that they are capitulating. So in a way, while you don't want the status quo right now to remain, it is a preferred option to looking for some negotiated settlement. So while frozen conflicts might be lamented publicly, they are indirectly favored and sometimes even supported by outside members in order to maintain a status quo that, if it doesn't improve your side, it does enough to deny leverage to the other side. Right? And so a frozen conflict might mean that you have not achieved all of your objectives in whatever the conflict was. But by remaining where you are preventing your opponent from achieving any more objectives than they have already claimed. So you remain at your post. You remain, locked and loaded simply because by letting your guard down, you give ground potentially to the other side. So you kind of remain in, for lack of a better term, a frozen state of affairs where neither side can maneuver or outmaneuver the other. So that kind of gives us pause to think, how does one even think of resolving the conflict of a frozen conflict, right? If both sides are kind of entrenched and dug in, right, where does one begin? The first thing to understand, right, and over the past 2 weeks, we've kind of looked at the political ramifications of conflict resolution, the hidden agendas that all sides have. It's not just simply ending a war, but it's also trying to get one side to maximize their goals and objectives at the direct expense of the other, and any kind of third-party arbitration trying to be some kind of open-ended, objective mediator. So in this case, we need to understand, right, frozen conflicts are just as politically deliberate as they are circumstantial. So beyond just simply the military being able to block the other one from making any further moves, frozen conflicts also have diplomatic elements as well. Right? So it's not just simply North Korea versus South Korea, but it's the countries that support each other. It's South Korea and the United States versus North Korea and China, right? To just be, rather, overly simplistic here. So it's a diplomatic deadlock alongside a military one. And yes, as I said, the two sides will bemoan the stalemate, but they will take that time in finding an advantage in prolonging any kind of negotiated settlement. Because as the days and the weeks and the years tick on by, right, these conflicts are, they're frozen in the sense that there's no major change in stature. There's no change in leverage. But on the ground activities just simply continue to entrench one side and the other. So, let's just say, we break this into challenger versus defender. And I think this is kind of be a little bit more easy to understand if we consider, parastates, right? Secessionist movements, breakaway movements, small groups within a country that, for whatever reasons that they have, legitimate or not, rise up against a central authority in the hope of either gaining more territorial control over their part of the country, gaining more political leverage, breaking away if need be, whatever have you, right? If the secessionist movement succeeds in, capturing territory within a state, but is unable to break away, right? I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, but outside powers step in, and, one group backs the central authority against the breakaway movement, and then another group backs the breakaway movement against the central authority. Well, now you've got diplomatic deadlock as well. Now, nothing can be done, particularly at the upper institutional level, right? Especially when we think that, powerful states in the United Nations are preventing anything from happening. But on the ground, let's say the challenger, sort of keeps whatever territory that they've had, because they're doing a really good job of preventing the central authority from coming back in and reasserting control. So as the days and weeks go by, the challenger entrenches their institutions, digs their heels in, right, ends up controlling de facto the territory, and just simply hopes that, one day a better future, better opportunities will present themselves. At the same time, the defender, which, we'll, refer to as the central government, the main state, they got one thing on their side, and that is, as long as the United Nations has not openly supported the breakaway secessionist movement, the territory is still legally theirs. They still have legitimate claim on that territory. They still have legitimate claim to the current borders. So the defender, rather than conceding, the defender doesn't want to concede at all. The defender wants to effectively hold out, play the game long enough, run the clock out, in hopes of winning additional international leverage and resource advantage. So while the conflict may be frozen, both sides are, reloading, re-strategizing, replanning, and hoping for some opportune moment to kind of break out of this stalemate and catch their opponent off guard in the hopes of increasing their leverage and gains at the direct expense of the other. Until that time happens, and as long as things kind of remain frozen in combat, in diplomacy, and others, the longer a frozen conflict exists, and we're talking not just years, but we're talking decades, frozen conflicts will eventually force negotiators, if they choose to tackle this problem, to accept the so-called realities on the ground that the status quo refuses to acknowledge, right? The status quo is either A, I want to break away, I want to become an independent country, or B, no, you can't break away, I control all the land. The negotiators that step in may not be in favor of changing the borders around of a country. Like, this rarely ever happens. One of the things that you just need to, take into account here, folks, is that when disputed territory is considered, it is rare, extremely rare, that borders will change, especially internal borders. I'll get to that in just a brief moment here. The thing is, as long as a breakaway group holds on to a piece of territory, right, the longer and the more likely it is that any new settlement is just simply going to have to recognize their control of that region. And so the challenger knows this. And so, it's been long enough, and there's been enough cases around the world where separatist movements can, if they can't achieve independence, right, they'll take up arms, they'll fight against the central authority, they'll kick them out of a region. They'll hold on to the regional capital, city, town, a number of government buildings, secure control over some, raw materials, some, resources like oil or water or whatever it is, and they'll just dig in their heels. It's just hold the fort. It is just, man the walls, hold the fort for as long as possible, run the clock out. And by this, you get your foot in the door, right? Sort of a tongue-in-cheek term here. It gets one's foot in the door and allows it to, control the territory de facto, even if a formal agreement is not signed. So when an agreement is signed in the distant future, the realities on the ground, especially if a new generation or two now grows up thinking that this is the new reality, will give a significant amount of control and leverage to that breakaway movement. So in other words, folks, and if I can make this as simple as possible, separatist movements, even if they don't achieve their ultimate goal of gaining a new country, of breaking away and, declaring independence, it still pays for them to resort to violence. It still pays for them to use violence as a way of upsetting the, pre-bellum status quo and forcing negotiators to look at the quote-unquote realities on the ground that will ultimately give them greater leverage and greater control. Okay? Now, this is what I've been talking about, really related to studies of what I call the parastates, right? And parastates are sort of a relatively new territorial entity, right? They're not entirely independent states. They're not entirely autonomous regions either. They're somewhere in the ambiguous gray zone middle. A parastate is a territorial region that has officially declared some form of sovereignty, but lacks formal international support and recognition to achieve full sovereign independence. In other words, a parastate possesses de facto authority, right? They control the territory, right? They control the roads, they control the hospitals, they take out the garbage, they design the education, they might even issue some passports, right? They are a state in all but name. The thing is, because a parastate has declared independence and claimed sovereignty in direct violation of another state's existence, the parastate is seen as less than legal, right? Less than legit, because the host state, right, and it's what we call the state that the parastate broke away from, the host state does not recognize that parastate's independence. And so now we have effectively a conflict, especially when the parastate relies on international sponsorship to keep it somewhat active, but the host state also has international support, right? So the parastate relies on an international backer to kind of keep it on the map, albeit in a slightly different shade of color than the host state. The host state, on the other hand, also has international support that keeps it out of the UN. This is the big thing. In order to be seen as a full legal sovereign state today, UN membership is the final and ultimate goal. So if you really want to make a very quick definition of a parastate, it is, in so many words, a disputed territory that claims sovereignty but is unable to enter the United Nations because of some diplomatic deadlock. That is because parastates do not coordinate their activities with the host state, which it broke away from. And not only does the host state seek to regain control over this breakaway territory, the parastate's primary job from Monday through Sunday is to prevent the host state from regaining that control. Right? So they arm themselves, they barricade the new border between them and the host state, they get international support to provide some kind of military deterrence. In fact, if a parastate can get a recognition from another country, right, even if it's just one or two diplomatic recognitions, that now makes it even firmly more secure in its limbo period here. Now, there are three types of parastates in the world: derecognized, secessionist, and terror. Derecognized parastates are a few groups of territorial anomalies, like Taiwan, the Palestinian territories, and Western Sahara. I'm not going to go into any of them right now. Suffice to say, these are not breakaway entities, but they are kind of like leftover I don't know, colonial holdings, sort of unincorporated territories. In Taiwan, it might have even have been at one point a recognized state whose status was diminished in lieu of mainland China. The thing is about these derecognized states is that they don't have UN recognition, and they are prevented from achieving full sovereign status by not so much a host state, but really a rival state, right? So for Taiwan, it's, People's Republic of China. For the Palestinian territories, it's Israel. And for Western Sahara, it is Morocco. I don't need to go too much into that. Terror states are a relatively new thing. And these are territorial entities that are actually either set up by or taken over by terrorist organizations. So the Islamic State, for instance, was for about 2 years a legitimate parastate. It claimed sovereignty. It claimed that it was a separate state from Syria and Iraq. And it, eventually ended up, gaining its own, citizenship, its own people. It's, secured a number of oil fields. So for a brief period of time, the Islamic State was making over $1 million a day just in the black market exportation of oil. Another example of a terror state was the briefly held Republic of Azawad in western Africa. It was a breakaway region of the country of Mali, which started out as a secessionist parastate, but then was taken over by an al-Qaeda affiliate, Ansar al-Din. And that just kind of, delegitimized any kind of claims to statehood. The thing about terror states is that they might control territory and they might function like a state in and of itself, but they rarely will get international support, right? It is rare, if not impossible, for international states to lend recognition or support to parastates founded on terrorism. So that leaves us with the middle one, the big one, secessionist states, right? And a secessionist state, right, is one that has formally and unilaterally declared independence from an existing host state, neither by coordination nor in accepting any kind of autonomous status, right? So a secessionist state basically decides of its own will it's going to break away from an existing country. It will not coordinate with the central authorities. The central authorities do not approve of this. They routinely try to prevent this from happening. And if it does happen, right, the parastate kind of is born in illegitimacy, right, because it does not have the legal ramifications for statehood, okay? And because of that, right, a secessionist state absolutely must rely on external sponsorship, right? From at least one powerful country to keep it alive, right? If you can get support from either the United States or China or Russia, or even a country as regionally powerful as, let's say, Turkey, you now have a friend in the region that will defend you. That will speak on your behalf diplomatically, that might begin some economic relations, and if need be, send in the military to defend you. Now, sponsorship can include, but does not require, sovereign recognition. Some parastates are recognized by their sponsor countries. The United States recognizes Kosovo. Turkey recognizes northern Cyprus. Russia recognizes Abkhazia. Okay. There are some parastates that don't need recognition just simply because the host state that they break away from has been too weak to really do anything about it. And that's, usually like Somaliland or Transnistria or something like that. Suffice to say, right, sponsorship is necessary. Recognition is not required, but if it does come, then your security is doubly assured, right? If once you get a recognition, especially a recognition from a big country, now all of a sudden you're on the map for the indefinite future. You're not a country, but you're on the map. And the reason why you're not really a country is because your claims to independence have to be opposed by at least one other powerful state that blocks the parastate's entry into international organizations. So even though the United States supports Kosovo, Russia and China do not. So the United States supports Kosovo. That puts Kosovo kind of sort of on the map. Russia and China oppose Kosovo. That keeps them out of the UN, right? Palestine has over 130 international recognitions, including Russia. But the United States, in the Security Council, along with Israel, opposes it and therefore prevents it from becoming a member in the UN. China opposes Taiwan, right? The United States opposes Abkhazia. So a parastate has to have one big brother friend, but it also has to have one big enemy, preventing the parastate from entering major international organizations like the UN, NATO, or the EU. Sometimes parastates can enter smaller regional organizations, provided that membership is not officially and specifically defined by sovereignty, right? So for instance, Kosovo and Palestine and Taiwan are members of the International Olympic Committee, right? They all three of them send teams to the Summer Olympics, the Winter Olympics, right? And you might think to yourself, how is that the case? Because the Olympics do not necessarily require team members to be a state itself, right? There are some territories that participate separately in the Olympics. The same thing goes for FIFA. It was about 5 or 6 years ago, I forget exactly when, Kosovo also made it as a member of FIFA. And this was a big thing for them because they thought, we're a country. And I said, not so fast. FIFA members also include territories like the Faroe Islands, England as opposed to United Kingdom. Northern Ireland has their own team. Oh, and the day that Kosovo was offered membership in FIFA, membership was also given to Gibraltar. Now, I was surprised as anyone else to know that Gibraltar, that little itty-bitty piece of rock peninsula at the southern tip of Spain, apparently it's a British colony, but apparently there's enough people there to warrant it having its own soccer team. So you can get into these organizations if membership is not necessarily a state. But when we talk about the UN, NATO, or the EU, this is where your road is indefinitely blocked, because there will be countries that will prevent you from getting in. Russia and China prevent Kosovo from getting into the United Nations. Spain, Cyprus, Greece, Romania, and Slovakia will prevent Kosovo from getting into NATO or the EU. And all it takes, folks, is one country to block you. If you've got more than one, well, then your obstacles are even more insurmountable. So, for instance, of the 5 EU countries that don't recognize Kosovo as a country, Spain, Greece, Cyprus, Slovakia, and Romania, right? Some of these countries could probably be persuaded at some point, like Slovakia and Greece could probably be persuaded, maybe even Romania. Cyprus has gone on record to say they will not ever recognize Kosovo's independence, largely because of their own internal issues with northern Cyprus, right? The Turkish-controlled northern Cyprus. So Cyprus is not going to recognize a parastate while opposing one of their own. The same thing kind of goes for Spain. And this is doubly sure in light of Catalonia's attempted secession about 2 or 3 years ago. Right? So Spain has also been very clear that they have no intention of recognizing Kosovo unless, and this is the thing, unless the host state, Serbia, recognizes. But as long as Serbia knows it's got friends in powerful places, they can't be persuaded to do so either. So hence, we've got the impasse, the stalemate, the frozen conflict. Even though the host state can rest comfortably knowing that they're under no pressure to recognize what they see as illegal secession, it must be remembered the host state is unable to regain control over the region. If it was a simple one-to-one fight, if the rest of the world stepped out, the host state probably possesses enough military capabilities to invade and take over. So if Serbia was not opposed by the United States or NATO or anybody else, the Serbian army could enter Kosovo and capture the entire territory in 3 days. Right? There's just no question about it. Could, let's say, Cyprus invade northern Cyprus and retake it? Absolutely. Could China retake Taiwan? They can retake Taiwan in 1 day if need be. But the Parastate is defended by one other big power. So whether it is through military deterrence, political stalemate, or even the high costs of reintegration, right? This is the other thing. Host states want the territory. They don't really care about the people. But we're living in 2020. You can't do ethnic cleansing, you can't do population expulsion or any of that kind of stuff in this day and age, right? So you want the territory, you're going to have to deal with a whole bunch of people that don't want you. So oftentimes the price of reintegration, while, you can think about it in your own little nationalist circles, would be great, when practicality comes through, it's a very, very expensive piece of real estate. So the host state, just suffice to say, is unable to regain control for a number of reasons. And therefore, the Parastate remains in this declarative sovereign status, but lacks constitutive. Okay? What is really the difference, right, between the two? Oh, I took that slide out. Real simple, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this. Declarative sovereignty is really the first phase of sovereignty, right? Declarative sovereignty is simply declaring your sovereignty, asserting your independence, and just kind of assuming that that should be enough to, legitimize your hold, right? You just, in the olden days, you walked up to a hill, you planted a flag in the hill, and you say, I claim this land for, whatever. And, up until I would say the turn of last century, that was kind of all you really needed. Right? Particularly, as territories were emerging against, colonial or imperial holdings. But in the real world today, that's not enough anymore. In the real world today, constitutive sovereignty is what gets you all of the credibility. And that is that your claim to sovereignty has to be legally recognized. So you can't just simply declare it and call it a day. You have to be recognized. And you have to be recognized by large-scale international bodies, like the United Nations. So in this case, constitutive states are also declarative states, but they have that legal security in knowing that their claims to sovereignty are backed up through international institutions. You don't have that. You might be able to control the territory today, or tomorrow, or a year from now, but there's nothing really guaranteeing that you won't lose it at some point when the host state, which has constitutive sovereignty, gets around to retaking the territory. Okay? So this is the thing about parastates, is that declarative sovereignty might have been good in the 19th century, but in the 20th and 21st century, you got to also have constitutive. And look, let me be really, really clear. Having constitutive sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean that you're a strong state. It just simply means that you're in the UN. Right? Somalia, Haiti, South Sudan, Chad, and the Central African Republic all have constitutive sovereignty. They all have seats in the UN. They're all horribly weak, corrupt, failed states. Some of these parastates are actually more internally cohesive than some UN member states. Right? Even Kosovo. Abkhazia, Somaliland is actually better off than Somalia itself. Taiwan actually is one of those few rare case success story parastates. They've got maybe 25, international recognitions, but their economy keeps them strong, and they got a passport that is almost universally recognized. In fact, their passport, the Taiwanese passport, actually gets you into more places than mainland China. But Taiwan is a special case. Right? More often than not, a parastate might have some smaller internal cohesion. But if you ever plan on visiting the UN, you're going to be getting a visitor pass. You don't have a spot in the General Assembly. You cannot speak on behalf of yourself. You have to be invited in. So every time the delegates from Kosovo go to the UN to try to talk about how awesome they are, they have to be led around by the United States. Right, the United States has to basically serve as their chaperone whenever they go there. And I've been to the UN a couple of times. You get these, delegates from Kosovo that are constantly lurking in the hallways, looking for ambassadors and diplomats to other countries, asking for recognitions, practically even bribing them at some points. This was, in their first years of, unilateral independence. So we've gone through some of the examples, like Northern Cyprus, which has been a parastate since the 1970s, Transnistria, another little breakaway region from Moldova that has effectively been, self-sufficient de facto since 1991. The Artsakh Republic, which up until about a month ago was also one of the most heavily fortified territories, and a frozen conflict that looks like it was going nowhere until about a month ago. Azerbaijan finally was given the military leverage by Turkey with weapons, tanks, and about 2,000 to 3,000 Syrian mercenaries that were thrown into the mix here, and eventually ended up taking back control of about a third of the territory until Russia steps in as a third-party arbiter, and the ensuing peace agreement has drastically reduced the territory of Artsakh to what is now effectively about maybe 3/4 of the original Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast, but a lot of other territory will be given back to Azerbaijan, which has always claimed de jure sovereignty over lands that it has not controlled for almost a quarter century. Right? More on Artsakh in a bit here. Then we have Somaliland. I know it sounds silly, but Somaliland is a little breakaway region of Somalia that broke away in 1991. And, you know how Somalia is. It's not the strongest state in the world. Somaliland is actually doing better. It is actually more cohesive and more democratic than Somalia itself. So the inability of Somalia regaining control over the territory, in addition to Somaliland being tacitly supported by Ethiopia, is that Somaliland is just more defensible than Somalia itself. Somalia is a very, very weak state. But that's not to say that Somaliland will be a parastate indefinitely. It has no real international recognition. I believe it is in the Organization of African States, but it has no major international recognition, right? Neither, Ethiopia has not extended a recognition. The same thing actually goes with Artsakh, is that it was openly supported by Armenia, but Armenia never recognized the independence of Artsakh. Kosovo, we've been talking about extensively, is probably the primary parastate right now. It enjoys about 95 international recognitions, including the United States, France, the UK, Germany, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. I mean, it's, in a very, very good spot. But its independence is also opposed, not surprisingly, by Serbia, Russia, China, Spain, Cyprus, Greece, India, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, you get the idea, right? So Kosovo is probably the most frozen of all frozen conflicts here. And then we have the, two little breakaway parastates of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are recognized by Russia. Russia, supports them. Their independence is opposed by the United States, which is a great way to pause here and think to yourself, now, wait a minute. Parastates can gain the support of one great power that, will make the argument in favor of their independence and their self-determination and their right to have their own country because of some horrible experience that they had in the host state. But that very same country will then turn around and oppose the independence of another parastate, right? So the United States will make all of these normative arguments about Kosovo being an independent country, but then look at Abkhazia and South Ossetia and say, hey, Russia, you can't do that. You can't screw with another country's borders. To which Russia kind of looks at them and says, I can't believe you said the quiet part out loud here, But if Russia supports Abkhazia and South Ossetia, why don't they support Kosovo? And the answer is very simple. Great power politics are at play here, ladies and gentlemen. You might think to yourself that parastates might have an argument, either for or against their existence in international legal framework. And that might work. But when we talk about international legality, it usually falls on the side of the existing host state, the one that possesses constitutive sovereignty. Parastates at best possess only declarative. But at the end of the day, the great powers can pick and choose whichever ones that they want. So Turkey sends in its military and its diplomats and everybody else to assist Azerbaijan in taking back what Turkey believes is its rightful territory. Yet, will throw in every ounce of support necessary for northern Cyprus. So is there hypocrisy afoot? Yes, if you consider it within liberalist circles. Is self-interest great power politics at play? Absolutely, if you take the tone of realism. The United States will go out of its way to oppose Palestinians' statehood and membership in the UN. They will veto anything that comes to the Security Council. Why? Because they support Israel. The United States has routinely called for Kosovo to be admitted to the United Nations. And, of course, we know that Russia will veto it at the Security Council. The United States does not recognize Taiwan's independence, but recognizes that Taiwan is a separate entity from that of China. China, on the other hand, wants Taiwan to effectively be reduced of any status to the point of eventually being reincorporated. So what's the deal with great power politics? Very simple. They will support a parastate if they can get something out of it. Russia can get something out of a foothold in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The United States, what do they get out of Kosovo? The largest U.S. military base in all of Europe. The Albanians are overwhelmingly pro-American. The Turks look at northern Cyprus as basically a veritable colony in that sense, right? So there's a lot of subjective self-interest at play here that in some ways puts a parastate on the map, but with dotted borders instead of solid. And also other states that use their self-interest to prevent these parastates from entering into the UN. Okay? To a lesser extent, the Donbas region is kind of sort of a parastate, right? The eastern regions of Ukraine have broken away and either want to create their own country or merge with Russia. Russia obviously supports the separatist region here, but has not gone so far as to recognize their independence. Okay, so with all of that said, where does conflict resolution come in? Where does international organizations play? And, I've studied the concept of parastates now for a number of years, and I unfortunately have some sort of depressing news. All right, the conflict resolutions for parastates, by notion of them being a frozen conflict, are limited, and the options are few and far between, with solutions being little more than baby steps. Okay? Now, we talked about some of them in class, but it's worth repeating again. Option one, the host state finally bites the bullet and recognizes. Option two, the parastate chooses to reintegrate within the host state, right? They realize, it's really the other way. The parastate realizes it's as good as it's going to get. They're not getting into the UN, and nobody really wants to invest in parastates because of their volatility, right? So we're not exactly talking about the most developed regions, in the world here. Option three, the parastate just simply joins a neighboring state, right? We don't want to be part of the one we broke away from. We are never going to be one of our own, so how about you just shove us into an existing state? Problem solved, right? Option four, we can partition the parastate, right? Sometimes the host state just wants some gains back, they don't want the whole thing back. And, deal with the rump parastate. We can maybe make that an independent country. The host state gains something back in return. Or the rump territory goes into, an existing country, whatever. Option five, hey, when all else fails, send in the military. Doesn't happen often, but you know what? When you do, you'd be surprised how quickly the status quo changes in your favor. And then finally, option six, barring any of that, the international community does what it does best, try to obfuscate the realities and just call for a normalization of relations. All right, we put that kind of in quotes here. All right, let's go through them in a little bit more detail and see why some of them are pretty much dead on arrival the minute that they're brought up. All right, option one, the host state recognizes. Right? Now, the argument in favor of this is pretty simple. The host state realizes it's just not ever going to get this territory back. Not anytime soon, right? You might want the land, you don't want the people. We can't do that anymore. It just doesn't work. And look, let's be honest here. For Moldova, does Transnistria really do anything for you? Even for Serbia, does Kosovo really do anything for you? I mean, Kosovo has been for decades the poorest and most undeveloped region in the Balkans, if not in, why? It's like, if you think about this, from a practical economic standpoint, you're getting rid of dead weight. You're getting rid of something that you're never really going to, adequately control. So why not just cut your losses and say, hey, you know what? We may lose territory, but we're getting rid of an unruly group of people as well. We don't want them. So, you know what? Out of sight, out of mind. Well, the con is that if a parastate is created through terrorism and separatism, if the host state recognizes, then it gives legitimate credence to what is basically an armed uprising and a seizure of territory, right? And look, this is not, giving up colonies. Now, parastates are not colonies in the olden sense. Now, this question came up in the grad version on Monday, right? Someone had asked, hey, look, Great Britain gave up the United States, France gave up Algeria, so, why can't we do the same thing here? And the answer is parastates usually break away from the core territory. This is contiguous territory. This is not some offshore piece of territory, right? This is home guard here. So Algeria and the United States, these are colonies. And colonies don't really have the same type of status as core territories do. So for a host state to recognize what ultimately was an armed uprising means that they have no international support whatsoever, right? They've been held against their will and they finally are forced to recognize. And this here is the reality, folks. If a host state, for as long as we've been talking about, can rely on international support of itself, they're really under no pressure to recognize, right? Serbia does not have to recognize Kosovo in any meaningful way as long as they know that they've got the backing of Russia, China, Spain, and Cyprus, and let's say Greece. This is like the big five. Or India, better yet. Russia, China, India, Spain, and Cyprus. Done. Kosovo could gain another 10 recognitions tomorrow. They're still not getting into the UN if those recognitions are not from key countries. Right? If Kosovo is recognized by, Namibia, right? Or Mexico, it doesn't really change anything. At the same time, Kosovo could lose recognitions. If Kosovo loses 10 recognitions tomorrow, let's say that they lose recognitions from Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Now that would be a psychological blow, but it's not going to really change their positions, right? Kosovo could lose 85 recognitions by the end of the year. As long as they are recognized by the United States, France, Germany, Turkey, and maybe the UK, Kosovo's not going anywhere. So as long as you've got core support, you can continue to play in this frozen conflict. And there's really nothing that can be done to coerce Serbia to recognize. There's always this idea that, Serbia won't get into the European Union if they don't recognize Kosovo. And you begin to realize how flimsy that threat is when you understand that 5 EU countries don't recognize Kosovo either. So if Cyprus and Spain don't recognize, then why should Serbia? And if the only thing that you could do is delay Serbia's membership in the EU, Well, that also is somewhat of an empty threat because the EU has been dragging its feet on accepting new members now for years. Almost a decade has gone by. And there's really no interest that the EU has been giving out. And not only that, the EU is no longer as great as it once was. I mean, yes, Serbia would want to get into the EU, but not getting in is not the end of the world for them, right? As time goes by, right, they've been able to secure, economic relations and agreements with a number of countries on a one-by-one basis. So if the worst thing that you can tell Serbia is that your EU membership is delayed, they're like, okay, fine, no, oh no, please stop, Okay, fine. I'll still oppose Kosovo's membership, or independence. So option one is really not feasible, right? There's just, if the host state had to recognize, they would have done so already. Equally unlikely is option two, reintegration. The Parastate is the one that now realizes the game is up. They cannot do anything without, they can't go any further. Right? They've got the recognitions that keep them on the map, but not enough to get them into the UN, not enough to really get major economic investment. They're still basically blocked from the rest of the world, right? You could be an autonomous region within an internationally recognized state, and suddenly you got access to the UN. You got access to the EU, NATO, any other organization. When you're a parastate, you're kind of the bad boy. No one really wants you because you're not entirely legal in that sense. So the Parastate opts for reintegration. Yay. The pro is, congratulations, the territorial integrity of the state has been preserved. And this is one of the things that conflict resolution practitioners want. Right? They don't want to change the borders. So we get rid of an unruly idea, and the good people at Rand McNally don't have to change the borders. The con for this, and this is interesting, is what is the cost? What is the cost of reintegration? If the parastate chooses willingly to reintegrate, they still have a lot of bargaining leverage. And what they could be asking for in return for reintegration might be more than what the host state can either actually afford or choose to accept. And another reality of this is that just by the grace of history, no parastate has ever voluntarily been reincorporated into the state it broke away from. Reincorporation happens only through military conquest. So there has been no parastate that came to its senses and thought, you know what? The game is up. I think I'll just go back to the country I fought so hard to break away from. So it's an idea, but it's an idea that is kind of aloof from historical circumstance. In fact, I'll give you a really good example of this, and that is Cyprus. Okay? Here's northern Cyprus, Turkish-occupied area. This is what we'll just simply call Cyprus, right? The Greek state, the capital, Nicosia, the one that is universally recognized as such. When Cyprus is approaching EU membership in 2004, the UN finally realizes, oh crap, if Cyprus joins the EU without Northern Cyprus can remain isolated indefinitely. So the United Nations, under the then General Secretary Kofi Annan, decides to come up with a policy, a conflict resolution policy for reuniting the island under the creation of a new United Republic of Cyprus. Now, what are the terms? What were the proposed terms of this so-called Annan plan? Without dismantling the institutional functions of the Turkish part, which had existed for 30 years, the Turkish North would be granted federal status within an existing Greek Cypriot state. So in other words, the Turkish part would be kind of like its own localized autonomous province. Okay? And all of the internal mechanisms of Turkish Cyprus would remain, but just be subordinated to the Greek Cypriot state. But in addition to that, the Cypriot parliament would have a mandated number of seats reserved exclusively for the Turks. So in other words, even if the Turks had boycotted all of the elections, there would be a reserved number of seats that are only for ethnic Cypriot Turks. And, it doesn't really go into the details over, are these seats reserved for actual Turkish Cypriots or people that were born in Turkey that kind of migrated there, right? Because ever since the invasion, the Turkish state has encouraged people by the tens of thousands to migrate from Turkey to Cyprus to basically hold the piece of territory, to just definitively shift the demographics in Turkish favor. And this is something that the Greek side has been absolutely opposed to because it's effectively preventing the Greeks from ever returning, right, after that invasion. So whether it's, Turkish settlers or, so-called native Turks of the island, it allows the Turkish community to serve as a kingmaker in all government coalitions. A situation that, as of then, right, Cypriot Greece, Greek Cyprus, whatever, was almost overwhelmingly an ethnically homogeneous state. So, they all spoke Greek. There was no need for power sharing. Now, all of a sudden, you've got to share power with the people that had been actively working to dislodge territory from your country. And as a final item on this peace agreement, one of the big open-ended issues, right, we want to talk about protracted social conflict, has been the desire of displaced Greek Cypriots to return to their homes in the north that they were kicked out of in the 74 invasion. Reclaiming their land, they have all the legal deeds to the house, whatever it is, the uprooting of these Turkish squatters. The Annan plan realized that this is too much of a rupture of realities on the ground to return to, right? We're not going to, turn the clock back 30 years and say everybody goes back to where they were prior to the invasion of 1974. So while some land from northern Cyprus would be returned to Greek control, it was little more than cosmetic, right? It was little more than really cosmetic, which was not enough to get the Greeks to accept the terms of reintegration, right? The Greeks want to reunify the island. They want to reclaim control, right, over the north. But their idea is sending in the military and expelling all the Turks from the islands. This plan basically unifies the island, but not according to what they want. So when the plan was submitted for a referendum in both the Turkish and the Greek sides of the island, the Turks overwhelmingly voted in favor, while the Greeks overwhelmingly rejected, right? And when we also think about the new Cypriot flag would be this weird color-coded whatever that has absolutely no national bearing whatsoever to Greek or Turkish identity. I mean, it's really a flag designed by a committee. I mean, it was effectively a peace plan that was doomed to fail because the host state felt that the conditions for reincorporation were just way, way too expensive. Okay? So being reorganized as a federal state by basically giving the Turks a significant degree of power, the very people that broke away were now rewarding them. This is effectively the idea, is that if they accepted the Annan plan, that the 74 invasion was completely justified, and it gave them a lot more power than they had prior to that invasion. Now, the costs of reintegration have also kept peace agreements from being ratified in other disputed territories. Up until recently, the so-called Madrid Principles, which defined the terms of a ceasefire and conflict resolution over Nagorno-Karabakh, right, that area between Armenia and Azerbaijan, called for the reincorporation of the entire Armenian-controlled territory back to Azerbaijan, and only the small region of Nagorno-Karabakh would go back to its 1991 era of autonomy. All the other regions surrounding that area that Armenians controlled would go back to Azerbaijan. Now, up until about a month and a half ago, this was seen as unheard of. Since the Azerbaijani military invasion, the Madrid principles may very well be given to them, and the Armenians may be very happy to accept it now based on saving what can be saved. When we talk about Ukraine, the so-called Minsk II protocols calls for Ukraine's territorial integrity, especially with the eastern regions, to be preserved. But the Russian-held regions would be given a significant degree of institutional autonomy. The Ukrainian government is absolutely opposed to this because, once again, they feel that granting autonomy to these regions rewards separatists, rewards rebels and terrorism. It also gives Russia sort of a backdoor entry into Ukraine. So since then, the Minsk II remain, along with the Madrid and the Annan plans, either dead on arrival or just, part of the archives of each respective frozen conflict. Okay, what about option 3? If, we can't, recognize and we can't reincorporate, how about the parastate is absorbed into a neighboring state, right? You could make a number of arguments for that, right? The self-determination of the group is fulfilled. They want to break away from one country, right? Albanians don't want to live in Serbia. Armenians don't want to live in Azerbaijan. How about we just attach them to a neighboring country? Albanians break away from Kosovo, and Kosovo joins Albania. Artsakh breaks away from Azerbaijan and joins Armenia. Northern Cyprus just joins Turkey. No parastate, no problem, right? A quasi-legal entity has been done away with. Sounds great, right? No. This is actually one of the worst situations. This is one of the worst situations because not only does this effectively legitimize irredentism, right? The whole idea of breaking away and, their entire goal. Kosovo didn't want to become an independent country. They wanted to merge with Albania. So this actually goes to the heart of real hardcore primordial nationalism. But the other thing is, if you decide to change the borders in one region, I guarantee you every Tom, Dick, and Harry secessionist movement around the world is going to say, me too. So, if Kosovo just joins Albania, I guarantee you 49% of Bosnia will want to join with Serbia. Artsakh will want to join with Armenia. Northern Cyprus will want to join with Turkey. The Donbass region, everybody's going to be like, let's just redraw the borders. And as I've been saying beforehand, one of the big things about conflict resolution, if you can help it, don't ever, 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 ever try to redraw the borders. Okay? Don't ever redraw the borders, which is one of the reasons why Kosovo has as many opponents as it does. So the reality on the ground is that while this can be spoken about in, off the record, nobody officially wants to pursue this because it is just going to open up a Pandora's box. Even if we talk about territorial swaps, where a part of Kosovo stays with Serbia, a part of Serbia goes into Kosovo, the rest of Kosovo goes, it's like, no. The minute we start redrawing boundaries, it's going to just create a chaotic mess. Because then, if national boundaries are sort of up for grabs, I guarantee you it's going to create more problems than it is. So we acknowledge that this option is there, but we quickly shoot it down along with options 1 and 2. Okay, what about option 4? Partition. Okay, partition. A lot of times, parastates still have territory in which people from the host state live in. So it's not a real hard division between one group or another. And as a kind of a way of breaking through the frozen conflict, there have been ideas of redrawing the border of the parastate itself, right? So the host state doesn't get the whole thing back, but it gets some areas, some towns, some pieces of territory back, right? As a way of saving what could be saved while writing off the rest, right? It's kind of like a plea bargain. So for instance, with, let's say, Serbia once again over Kosovo, right? The European Union could tell Serbia, okay, you can get the northern tip of Kosovo, maybe a few areas here or there in as compensation for you writing off the rest. And this is something that has not been entirely rejected in Serbia, right? But it never really reaches the official channels, either because hardline nationalists are like, no, it's all or nothing, or B, more likely, we're still redrawing borders, right? It still, validates armed secession. So it's really no better than the Parastate joining another country. So once again, it's redrawing borders. It's going to give precedence to other would-be movements, right? So the goal here for solving a parastate is either the whole thing becomes independent, or we find a way of shoving it back into the host state with a number of concessions, right? This is kind of the pattern that we really see, which is why option 5 is a bit more successful, okay? All else fails, all options have been exhausted, and you suddenly have the leverage to do so. It's a gamble. It's not one that is guaranteed to work, but if you can do it, use the military. A military invasion, especially from the host state, is basically retaking occupied territory. And chances are, once the host state retakes all or a significant portion of the parastate, it's internationally recognized as such. So while there are risks involved with the military, one of the advantages is that it just gets rid of the parastate altogether, right? If the military is used and they're able to capture the whole thing, there's no need for a negotiated solution. Whatever leverage the parastate had, whatever local government it may have elected, they're over and done with, right? They run for the border, they're captured, they're arrested, they're killed, whatever it happens to be done. You eliminate what is effectively a secessionist government, and order has been restored. It's not pretty, it's oftentimes messy, but the international community really isn't gonna condemn you for taking back what is effectively your recognized territory. Now, the only con, actually there are two cons to this, but the first one is even if you're successful, there is a very high probability that the consequence is ethnic cleansing, which, if you're a hardliner in the host state, you don't really care. Out of sight, out of mind. You're all running for the border. You're burning down your villages. Great. We didn't want you to begin with. We got what we wanted. We got the land without the people, right? But chances are, in order to make certain that the parastate does not come back, even if there is a mass flight for the border, that is still ethnic cleansing. And enough has happened over the past 30 years for that to be considered a possible war crime. The last month that we saw with Azerbaijan retaking about a third of Artsakh territory and will eventually be given another third in a land exchange, it remains to be seen how many Armenians will continue to live within that territory. But the leverage that Armenia and Artsakh as a separate parastate had has now been significantly diminished. Okay, so in many cases, you don't really care about the consequences because you now can come to the bargaining table with a lot more leverage and a lot more behind you. Okay, now, as I said, it is risky to do. You might not be successful in this. If you are, well, congratulations. But there have been a number of attempts by the host state to regain control and have failed. Georgia tried to take back control of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008. Both of these groups call on Russia for support. Russia decides to mobilize. Russia sends in its military. And now the Georgian army is no longer fighting a bunch of separatist irregulars. They're fighting the Russian army. Georgia then calls on the United States for help. The United States says, we're not getting ourselves involved in a war with Russia. The Georgian army is routed from its own territory, is kicked out, and in return, both Abkhazia and South Ossetia realize that this is now a point of no return. They have successfully defended their homeland declared independence, which they didn't do beforehand, and have been recognized by Russia. Now, interestingly enough, before 2020, Azerbaijan tried at least 1 or 2 times since 1995 to take back control of Artsakh, and both times they have failed. The Azerbaijani army is about 5 times larger than that of Armenia, but Artsakh ended up being one of the most heavily fortified regions, not only in the Caucasus, but in the world. And 2 times beforehand, the Azerbaijani army was highly demoralized and under-equipped. So every time there was an attempt at taking back control, not only did the Armenians push back the invaders, but gained additional territory, to the point where it should have been that Artsakh declares independence. Russia would have been a valuable country to recognize, but Russia likes to play both sides. Russia supports both Armenia and Azerbaijan. So in this case, they got no real recognition. And even after Azerbaijan takes over about a third of Artsakh today, they do so by losing more than 10,000 soldiers. I mean, it was basically a bloodbath. And they only were able to get back a third of the territory before Russia steps in. So military invasion is, if you can do it, smoke if you got 'em. But there are risks, and you may not be able to regain control. If you try and you fail, the Parastate can then look to the international system for support and might get a few recognitions in return. One thing to mention before we move on from this option is that one surefire way of the military regaining control is if the target, Parastate, is run by a terrorist organization. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, the state of Azawad was taken over within a month by some affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and were threatening to kind of go all Islamic State on the people. This gave the host state, Mali, along with its major international partner, France, the wherewithal to militarily engage. It also, was condemned routinely when the terrorist organization threatened the cultural heritage and monuments of Timbuktu, You may have heard of this little place in Africa, maybe through fairy tales or something like that, But Timbuktu, houses, in addition to a number of historical monuments and landmarks, one of the oldest libraries in the world. So we're talking about a number of medieval-era manuscripts, priceless manuscripts, that were in danger of being destroyed by Ansar al-Din. So this was enough for Mali to use its, diplomatic leverage to get international support, to send in its military and rout the terrorists, So the state of Azawad collapsed shortly after it was taken over by terrorists. The same thing with Russia, with Chechnya. In the early 2000s, Putin had finally modernized his army to go in and retake what was effectively a breakaway separatist entity. Now, Chechnya got really no international support because they very quickly became a safe haven for terrorists. And, once you begin to realize that a lot of Chechens were kind of the first round of fighters for Al-Qaeda, the international community doesn't really lament that much when a terrorist parastate is taken over. If a parastate is somewhat democratic and they are taken over militarily, they might get some sympathy from the rest of the world in the nature of the peace agreement. So Artsakh might be a little bit different, but that kind of remains to be seen. And finally, the last option is what we call just simply normalization of relations. This is your total bureaucratic approach to a frozen conflict. And that is recognizing that the conflict is intractable and that both sides begin negotiations on 2 non-negotiable terms. The Parastate wants everything but reincorporation. The host state is willing to offer whatever instead of separation. So where do you kind of find common ground, Where do you find common ground between the parastate and the host states? Well, one thing that you do is you just kind of agree to approach the situation in a status neutral format. So you tell both sides, the parastate will not return to the host state. And you tell the host state, the parastate will not enter the UN at the end. But we need to kind of address some more day-to-day concerns, like the free flow of traffic and goods, the unblocking of roads, the rebuilding of villages and the preservation of cultural monuments, small things, small things that don't necessarily involve status per se. Now, this ends up being a con really only for the parastate because it leaves the parastate in diplomatic limbo. They might be able to sign a number of agreements with the host state. And they'll turn around and they'll say, "Oh, look, we signed an agreement with Serbia, with Ukraine, with Azerbaijan, whatever. They recognize us as independent." And it's like, it's not so fast there, bucko. They didn't recognize anything, right? You can still sign agreements with a non-sovereign entity. You de facto control the territory, but we haven't made that de jure just yet. But what it does do is try to, bring some life into an otherwise depopulated and demoralized area. Now, this is, of all 6 options, the most preferred strategy. It's not the most straightforward, and it is certainly not the most clear-cut, but it is one that is done in the name of democratic development and regional collective security. The normalization of relations is what is proposed between Kosovo and Serbia, with the idea of getting Kosovo to be some kind of viable, working territorial entity. Right now, Kosovo's biggest export are its people. They're leaving in droves, never to really return. Right? Interestingly enough, the Serbs of Kosovo are better off than the Albanians because they've got Serbian passports. They are considered to be citizens of Serbia, so they are still, represented and defended by a sovereign state. What this does for Kosovo is kind of just kick the can of ambiguity down the road, right? Does this lead to, if not UN membership, does it lead to maybe EU membership? And would Kosovo be okay with being a member of the European Union and not the United Nations? Some Albanians are more than happy to do that. We don't care about the UN. But in that case, Kosovo either has to be upgraded to a full independent state, and it needs to bypass those 5 no votes on recognition, or, and this is something that is still within the woodwork here, and this could be one way forward for parastates, is that they are recognized as regions rather than sovereign states. If the European Union is to change its policy of membership to include not just states, but regional territories, then all of a sudden, we have a green light and an open pathway to places like Kosovo and northern Cyprus. Also, it avoids the possible scenario of Scotland voting for independence and breaking away from the United Kingdom. Right? Remember I talked about in class, Scotland did not want to leave the European Union, but with Brexit, they had to. They had to leave with the rest of England. If Scotland is offered an opportunity to re-enter the EU as a regional territory, as opposed to an independent state, that might preserve the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom and avoid a rather embarrassing and costly secession. But that is something that is only still whispered among policymakers, not really advocated out loud just yet. But it is something to think about. It is something to think about. And it is one of the very few ways in which parastates can maneuver out of their diplomatic impasse and emerge from the frozen conflicts that they find themselves in for years, if not decades. All right, and that wraps up really the first part of our ending discussion here. And this should put us now all up to date on the material that we covered in class. What I will do next is provide a dedicated lecture on human rights and the concept of humanitarian intervention. And that will be followed by a third lecture discussing the role of international institutionalism tackling transnational problems created by environmental concerns. So those are going to be our two last final big discussions for the semester, and then we're going to wrap up with a recap of everything, which should put you in a really good position to write that final paper. So stay tuned. I hope that you are enjoying your Thanksgiving break. Feel free to email me with any questions or concerns that you may have. And if I don't hear from you beforehand, I will see you, quote unquote, see you on Zoom next Monday. All right? Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care.